Good evening and welcome on this beautiful autumn evening. I'm Susan Galassi, Senior Curator at the Frick Collection, and it's an honor to introduce our speaker this evening, Christopher Le Brun, the distinguished painter, printmaker, and sculptor, and current president of the Royal Academy of Arts in London. Mr. Le Brun's lecture is part of a series of talks by artists, writers, and poets, sponsored by the Drue Heinz Trust. I would like to thank the Trust for its long time and generous commitment to this program that brings well-known figures in the arts to the Frick. Christopher Le Brun has been a regular visitor to the Frick over decades, especially to see the paintings by Turner. In these galleries, he's also in the company of past presidents of the Royal Academy, among them Sir Joshua Reynolds, Sir Thomas Lawrence, and Turner. And I like to think he consults with them on the tremendous difficulty of balancing the demands of actively pursuing his own art while directing and representing the Academy. He does both with extraordinary energy, vision, and accomplishment. I would also like to thank Nicola Tanieri from Mr. Le Brun's studio for her help in organizing this event. Christopher Le Brun grew up in Plymouth on the southern coast of England, a landscape that set him on his path as an artist. He went on to receive a classical education at the Slade School and at the Chelsea School of Art in the 1970s. After a period of teaching, he gained recognition in the early 80s at the Venice Biennale and at the famous Zeitgeist exhibition in Berlin. From then on, his work has been featured in major surveys of contemporary art and in solo exhibitions around the world. Mr. Le Brun's work can be found today in over 50 museums, including the British Museum and the Met. He has served on the board of several British institutions and museums. Christopher Le Brun is primarily a painter, and his work has deep roots in poetry, myth, and music. From the romanticism and symbolism of his earlier work, his painting has evolved into a form of veiled abstraction. A major exhibition entitled Composer, held last year at the Albert Spenda Gallery in New York, featured his large-scale, radiant canvases that evoke a sense of atmospheric space and musical analogies. Whether working in a figurative or more abstract manner, Mr. Le Brun said in an interview that his paintings are, quote, all about touch and presence and looking, which the art of the past was all about too. They express the continuity from one artist to another. Mr. Le Brun is also an extraordinary printmaker. His recent series of woodcuts, Seria Luda, meaning serious play, printed with just the pressure of his hand, are closely connected to his paintings. At times, he takes on very different challenges, such as monumental sculpture. In 2014, his spectacular white marble wing, Morrow, was installed in the Sculpture Park at Chatsworth. Mr. Le Brun was admitted to the Royal Academy in 1994 and elected president in 2011 by his peers. Next year, the Academy will celebrate its 250th anniversary, and there could be no more enthusiastic and articulate promoter of the institution as a force for innovation and inclusion than its current president. Among the projects he is overseeing is the renovation of the historic campus to make it more welcoming. The programming for the coming year will begin with a once-in-a-lifetime exhibition, Charles I, King and Collector, a collaboration of the Royal Academy and the Royal Collection Trust, which will bring together masterpieces spread across Europe. Given his even greater than usual responsibilities this year, we're all the more grateful that Christopher Le Brun could be with us this evening to discuss painting and poetry in his lecture entitled, Now Turn the Page. Please give a warm welcome to Christopher Le Brun.
Good evening, everybody. Over the years, I've become rather a connoisseur of my own introductions. And that's one of the most elegant, Susan, I've ever heard, so thank you for that. Also, I have to say your green room for performers is also one of the most spectacular in the world, since this green room contains Turner, Rembrandt, and so on. It's a particular privilege and honour to be here. And because of the nature of this collection, I've decided to attempt something which is, in other words, to talk about poetry, painting, and therefore about truth and other values like that. So as a painter, I have many predecessors, but as president of the Royal Academy, I have precisely 25. And amongst them are Reynolds, Lawrence, Leighton, and Millet. But also actually Turner, because when Martin Archer became ill, Turner was effectively the president. And closer, yes? Okay. How's that? Is that better? Thank you. Don't worry, I'm not going to start again. So Turner was effectively the president. This is enormously reassuring because it proves that a painter can also have another job. Because in fact, I wear my suit and tie for 3 days a week, and the rest of the time I'm in the studio. To put you in the world of poetry and the implications of poetry, we're starting off with this sculpture, as Susan said, which was displayed at Chatsworth. It's called Morrow, which you'll know is the other word for Virgil. Now, Turner never really forgot the teaching of Reynolds. In fact, he was there present in 1790 to hear Reynolds' last discourse. There's an easy assumption of Turner's radicalism, and it's partly reinforced because of the Turner Prize. But this is not quite correct, or at least it's oversimplified. Because Reynolds preached high art, and Turner effectively was very much an 18th century man imbued with classicism. And Reynolds taught about the great tradition, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Leonardo. In fact, the last word he uttered on his last discourse was Michelangelo. Many, many paintings by Turner are introduced by quotations from poetry to such an extent that the Academy actually banned long quotations because I think they were starting to become bigger than the paintings. Poetry was his way of guiding and shaping his perceptions of nature. And so for myself, looking back on my work and, as it were, to put it slightly pretentiously, my, as it were, intellectual history, I realize that these things have been important for me. The reason for the title of the lecture, Now Turn the Page, is very specific. When we were children, we had some talking books, which meant, and these things, I looked this up on the internet recently, so we had this book published in 1948. It consisted of a long-playing record, a 33 RPM record, and a book. And we lay on our tummies on the carpet, put the record on, and a story would be told. And at a certain point, a very BBC voice would say, "Now turn the page." But it was completely magical because we were involved with looking and listening and reading, all those things together. In fact, that early record, they were the short stories by Oscar Wilde. So in other words, the link, it seems to me, between poetry and painting is very direct. At the Frick, the other phrase I want to explore is high art. You cannot be in that room next door looking in the eye of the Rembrandt self-portrait, or looking at the Polish rider, or looking at the Turner painting of Cologne, without wondering to yourself how this extraordinarily special group of paintings came together, and how and why they converse with each other so easily. Imagine when we're not here, think of the room, and I imagine that conversation, that silent conversation going on at that level. It is, I think you'd agree, a question of the highest level of art. But what is high art? It's not talked about very often now. So these things, truth, authority, high art, these are in the contemporary world, all conceptual bear traps, and I'll probably fall into all of them as we go. When I talk about truth, for example, I'm not talking about truth in the case of the potential for there to be a falsehood or for something to be incorrect. I'm talking about truth in the sense of art. And truth in the sense of art is a type of unconcealedness, a type of openness, a type of trust that you have that what you're seeing has qualities that we can rely upon. The literary critic Harold Bloom, who I had the privilege to meet in Yale a few years ago, put it like this. He said, in ancient Rome, the concept of authority was foundational. Auctoritas, the Latin word, derived from the verb augere, to augment. And authority always depended on augmenting the foundation, thus carrying the past alive into the present. So, unless the form is added to, or refined, or refines the canon, it lacks authority. Now, the crucial word is augment. Thinking of the job that I do at the Academy with my fellow academicians, this is an absolutely crucial concept. It's not the substitution of novelty. It's certainly not, and more poignantly, the substitution of one generation for another. But I'd say it's the work of history which builds and searches out the foundations continually. The experience of looking at painting is very much, for me, an experience of the fullness of the moment. It's very particular, but it must be experienced. This painting is called Innocence, and innocence, I think, is another component of this idea. So, what is particular about painting is the experience and presence of painting. It's becoming increasingly rare for the communication of feelings to be in your presence. Most things are now increasingly virtual. We don't touch them, we're not in front of them, they're remote. But painting remains a thing in front of you, made by the hand. And I'll give you an example of how the potency of that still exists everywhere. If you ask someone to draw a diagram, or it might be a map, they'll often do it and then immediately apologize. They will say, I'm sorry, I can't draw, or please excuse my drawing. The point to me is not whether they can draw, whether they can't draw, but they intrinsically seem to recognize, it's implicit, that there's something in this act of mark making and science and drawing that has significance. We seem to be naturally interested in paintings and images. We're drawn to them. We're drawn to them. Presence in poetry also is experiential. Here's another example. I was at a wonderful a place in Grasmere in the English Lake District, which is the home of Wordsworth, Dove Cottage. And there was a wonderful director there called Robert Wolfe, and he read in that place a poem by Wordsworth, and it made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, because I'd read that poem before and never felt it. What it is was a poem about the death of Wordsworth's brother. And on the wall behind him was a painting by George Beaumont. George Beaumont was the figure who established the first paintings that went to the National Gallery. And it was a picture of a shipwreck. It wasn't the shipwreck in which Wordsworth's brother was drowned, but nevertheless the implication and connection was clear. But to hear Robert, with his particular regional accent, read that poem was very, very striking. Later on that day, they put into my hands, without gloves, Dorothy Wordsworth's diary. It's very slim, light thing, very, very precious. What's particularly precious is that Wordsworth found the act of writing painful, physically painful. So he'd walk and memorize and recite, and when they got back to the cottage, Dorothy would write it down. So you see again the experiential nature of poetry that I'm talking about. Now, art continues, of course, but in the current period, the truths of painting that I'm talking about are maybe less evident. Maybe they're never very evident. Maybe they always need to be sought out. Because a lot of art now is concerned with issues that few of us would disagree with, but are nevertheless not necessarily things to do with art. They can have expression in other forms. Now, any discussion about art now at a high level requires hints, subtlety, irony, shared memory, all of these things. But it's becoming increasingly complicated to do that because there are different authorities and different canons. So the atmosphere of high art which we experience here is very particular. It is the Western European canon of art. Once one goes outside of that, there are things of enormous interest, enormous energy, enormous creativity, but you're starting, as when you move outside the canonic, you make things complicated and difficult. So I'm going to read a poem for you. It's by Geoffrey Hill. Geoffrey Hill worked at Boston for a long time, and he was notoriously difficult. His poetry is difficult. And a big book of Hill's poetry sits next to what I call my thinking chair in the studio. It's there. I come back, I look at my painting, I pick up the book. And one day I came across this particular poem, and it's called The Jumping Boy. Here is the jumping boy, the boy who jumps as I speak. He is at home on the King's Highway in call of the tall house. Its blind gable end, the trees, I know this place. The road on broad contourings drawn out of sight stops wherever, but not at Lioness. Though from Lioness I shall bring you through grimed orchards, across gorse-hummocked old common land, everywhere given back to the future of memory. He leaps because he has serious joy in leaping. The girl's eyes no way allowed for, or else she's close in covert, and we are to know that, not knowing how. I'll bet she worships his plebeian bullet head, Hermes' winged plimsolls, the crinkled toy tin hat held on by elastic. He's winning a momentous and just war with gravity. This may be levitation. I could do that. Give my remembrance to his new body. These episodes occur. Jump away, jumping boy. The boy I was shouts, go. You can guess probably what I'm going to say. Jumping, physical activity, contained a truth for Geoffrey Hill that reminded him of his boyhood. What more meaning could there be in his life than his attempt to jump as high as he could in the full innocence of childhood? The physicality of the child is remembered by the poet, and it is, of course, a type of truth. The poem struck me for various other reasons, and I know that you don't have it in front of you, and it's quite a difficult poem to memorize, but there are phrases in it that mean a lot to me as an artist. He mentions the king's highway. So this is always a phrase of enormous evocative power for anyone used to stories, fairy tales. And it means a place where the law runs benignly and in safety. And of course, the tall house has something of the tower, but also something of the palace. Lioness reminds us of Camelot, and therefore for me of Tennyson. And Tennyson has a wonderful phrase which I think is about art. Tennyson says, talking about Camelot, "The city is built to music, therefore never built at all, and therefore built forever." So the law that he's talking about, the time he's talking about, is legendary. And again, that comes back to another memory of Edward Thomas, which is a poem I come to towards the end. But the key here is physical immediacy. And when he talks about the King's Highway, I come back to my idea of high art, because what I feel I want to say to you as a painter is I too am on the King's Highway. I'm passionate about painting. Painting is the most connected, the most ancient of the plastic art forms. If there's a sculptor in the room, please look away now, but of course I include sculpture. But my point here tonight is painting. Poetry is also ancient, but painting is the King's Highway of art. So I've been more explicit about this than you probably need. I'm sure that you got that analogy immediately. But you'll also be aware that most of the examples I have are from what one would call nature poetry. Now this phrase, nature poet, sounds increasingly odd today. We live in an urban world. But I think as a young man, the poets that interested me were nature poets: Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley. It seemed entirely natural, but now it's starting to feel less natural. But it's important, because I think what's being said there applies again to painting, because the nature poet is a solitary person. His perceptions, her perceptions are quiet. They're solitary. It is not a group activity. Again, there's a truth in that aloneness. It's also a type of silence which is in painting. There's a wonderful sentence by Franz Kafka in a short story called The Silence of the Sirens. And I was staying this summer on the coast about 3 hours south of Naples, and it's called the Siren Coast, because that's where, and in fact our villa was called Ligeia, which is the name of one of the sirens. And Kafka says this: "Now the sirens have a still more fatal weapon than their song, namely their silence. And though admittedly such a thing has never happened, still it's conceivable that someone might possibly have escaped from their singing, but from their silence, certainly never." So there's painting's great truth. The truth of the body's physical apprehension, presence, touch, experience, scale, colour, texture, but also silence and solitariness. This painting is called The Herald's Note. It's a very, it's a big painting. It's about 15 feet across. And the title came from this poem, which is by the English poet David Gascoigne. Gascoigne was an extraordinary figure who wrote probably what's the best introduction to surrealism. It's called a short survey of surrealism, written when he was only 20. So the poem is called Rex Mundi. I heard a herald's note announce the coming of a king. He who came sounding his approach was a small boy. The household trumpet that he flourished a tin toy. Then from a bench beneath the boughs that lately spring had hung again with green across the avenue, I rose to render to the king who came the homage, subjects owe. And as I waited, wondered why it was that such a few were standing there with me to see him pass, but understood as soon as he came into sight, this was a monarch no crowds of this world can recognize to hail him as they should. He drove past in a carriage that was drawn by a white goat. King of the world to come, where all that shall be now is new, calmly he gazed on our pretentious present that is not. Of morals, classes, business, war, this child knew nothing. We were pardoned when he smiled. If you hear it in the distance, do not scorn the herald's note. I think I was about 16 or 17 when I first read Keats, and at that point I realized the connection between painting and poetry, because there's a phrase in it, in the Ode to a Nightingale, which describes almost precisely Claude Lorraine's painting in the National Gallery in London, The Enchanted Castle, or The Palace of Cupid. So these moments really swept me forward into realizing that painting has always had a hinterland, and that references that we make in paintings aren't necessarily just to other paintings or visual forms or nature, but to phrases and memories and echoes that enrich it. Ezra Pound was another poet that I discovered. I remember in a hall of residence where I was staying, there was a copy of the cantos, and I took it down and back to my room. I didn't understand it at all. I didn't understand one bit of it. But gradually, little moments of tremendous lyricism came from this, again, very difficult poet. So my sympathy for Claude Lorraine might have started there, the introduction through poetry. Now, the other category, which I regard as a part of high art that one would expect to be there, that's special, is the category called visionary. And it's important to explain what I mean by that, since my next set of illustrations depend on it. For me, it carries a particular resonance because the artists I've been particularly interested in, such as Blake, Samuel Palmer, Burne-Jones, and Paul Nash, can all be described as visionary. The vision or the image, the instinct of an artist, is often in conflict with other values and intentions. And it's widely agreed by poets of the stature of T.S. Eliot and Ted Hughes that Coleridge was such a poet who suffered a crisis of creativity. And Wordsworth himself expressed misgivings about the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, whether it should be included in the original lyrical ballads, which was the introduction of the first great generation of romantics. Coleridge's undisputed visionary poems are Kublai Khan, The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and Christabel. And when he achieved those poems, Ted Hughes, the great poet himself, describes Coleridge as breaking through to the sea of images. Losing contact with the sea of images, losing contact with that visionary insight, is a persistent danger for all artists, because the world presses very close on us. I hesitate to identify myself with these artists, but nevertheless, you'll see that the job I currently have doesn't allow me to spend all my time breaking through to the sea of images. Mostly, I'm breaking through to the end of the next meeting. I'm trying to manage people and their feelings of unbelievable complexity and cussedness, frankly, but occasional vision. By the time I get to the end of Wednesday, I've used up every ounce of responsibility in my body. And then, which I've discovered recently, irresponsibility and the joys of irresponsibility suddenly break out. This painting is full of irresponsibility. The colour's there because the colour's there. And I'm too exhausted to do anything else but put the colour down and move and think and jump and use my body to think. But thinking with the body is not an unintelligent thing to do. The body that we inherit, in a sense, is the body that your parents gave you, and there's somehow, oddly, this memory in our hands. You know, when you have to walk across Grand Central Station, you can't do that calculation in your head, you just do it. You're taken across it from one side to the other as your body negotiates that complexity. And there's a strange phenomenon when one's painting, which is you get to the point you've struggled to get to, which is to lose yourself. And the point at which you lose yourself, in my case it's often through exhaustion, I'm too tired to stop myself doing what I really want to do, the hand seems to take over. Now, I don't know whether you can see that hand there. You see the way my fingers are? I can't straighten them. It's not because I've been holding a brush in my hand day in, day out for 30, 40 years. It's because it's a Viking genetic condition. I'm rather proud of that. I think it's probably more holding the oars than holding a battle axe. But there's something in the intelligence, the inherited intelligence of the body. And my grandfather was a stoker, a chief stoker on board HMS Terrible in the Boer War, shoveling coal. My father was on the Murmansk convoys in the cold as a Royal Marine, and then in Burma. A great-grandfather was a cordwainer, was a leather worker, hence Cordova, a maker of shoes. There's something going on in our physique which has a type of continuity. This is also a type of truth. How do we get that to unconceal itself? It's not about being right or wrong, this type of truth. It's a type of authenticity, human authenticity. The other great aspect of poetry, of course, is its connectedness. And there's a book I'd love to recommend, which again I came across very young and to some extent changed my view of how culture works. It's written by a wonderful, man of letters, I suppose, called John Livingston Lowes. And it's called The Road to Xanadu. He took Coleridge's notebooks and tracked every reference for the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. It's an enormous accomplishment. And he uses this phrase, the deep well of the imagination. It's about connectedness. So back again to my notion of the King's Highway. It's the place of the most connections. And the place of the most connections, as a German philosopher put it, he puts it, meaning is where the interpretations lie thickest. You don't need to say what the meaning is, you just know they are clustering around these things. It's one of the reasons we're drawn to painting, we're drawn to touch. We feel it instinctively. And when I talk about connectedness, this isn't a sort of Borgesian infinite library. It's a very specific thing. Many of us will have shared the same books, the same poems. We'll have that in our heritage. There was a writer called F.R. Leavis, some of you will remember from years and years ago, a man of great controversy and distinction. And he called this idea of the hinterland of poetry and literature the third realm. So these are works which are, as it were, a collaborative reconstitution of culture. Together, we share this particular resource. And George Steiner, who's had, again, like Harold Bloom, the privilege of meeting and actually painting his portrait, although that was the scariest thing I've ever done. I'll come back to that. George Steiner calls this the field of prepared echo. Poets and artists lay down these things. The field of prepared echo. And Hemingway called it iceberg theory. But I think Steiner's is the most potent. Actually, just briefly to say why George was so scary. I went to see him in Cambridge, and I revered this man. I'd read his books, and he's one of the cleverest people I've ever met. I said, "How do you want to be painted? How do you see yourself?" And he gripped the arms of the chair he was sitting in and looked me straight in the eye, like that great Ingres painting. What's it, Monsieur Bertin? Yeah, terrifying, completely terrifying. And I said, "George, you don't have to look at me in the eye all the time for the entire session. Would you mind just looking away now?" Anyway, but it was an immensely emotional experience for him. He felt himself, despite his distinction, as an outsider in British society. I disagree with him, but he felt himself to be an outsider. So for him, it was a sort of homecoming to be included in the National Portrait Gallery. And we talked very openly. I wasn't a rival in his world of literature. It was a tremendous experience. One other aspect of truth is something that's often called truth to experience. And many of you, again, will know the poet Philip Larkin. And Philip Larkin came up with this particular phrase, which would appear to contradict everything I've just said. Larkin says, "To me, the whole of the ancient world, the whole of classical and biblical mythology means very little. And I think that using them today not only fills poems full of dead spots, but dodges the writer's duty to be original." When an artist hears anybody say, "It's your duty to be original," it's the best way of clearing the dance floor. It's the most terrible thing to say. You do not want to hear that. I disagree with Larkin. Larkin also called those memories the common myth kitty. Larkin's a great poet, but he's a man of the 60s. Here's on my side Philip Sidney, writing in 1595. Rather different view. It's in An Apology for Poetry. He says, "Only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such objection, lifted up with the vigour of his own invention, doth grow in effect another nature, in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite anew, forms such as never were in nature, as the heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies, and such like. So as he goeth hand in hand, nature not enclosed within the narrow warrant of her gifts, but freely ranging only within the zodiac of his own wit." There. That's imagination. That's the poet's responsibility. Wallace Stevens, the great modernist American poet, and one can hardly talk about poetry and painting without mentioning him, uses the expression, the noble rider and the sound of words. He talks about the imagination being romantic in essence. Romantic is another word we are nervous of employing because it has been so, as it were, misused. But the true romanticism is imagination, genuine imagination, not cliché. As a young artist, I used more figuration. I'm not showing it here. This is concentrated on more recent work. But the reason I used those things was partly in defiance of what was considered to be the norm. This is the late 70s, heavily political art, conceptual art. Painting was regarded as rather antique. It was certainly antique to reintroduce symbol. But my instinct was that it contained something that made feelings arise that made us uncomfortable. Therefore, it was of interest. But actually, my work at that time, I felt increasingly out of kilter, and the things I was painting, subjects might have been Galahad, Tristan, Siegfried. I felt they couldn't be assimilated. Often in interviews I've said, I don't believe that irony is a key component of art. I'm now going to confess to you, they were ironic. But I mean deeply ironic. In other words, to expose the difficulty those images had in sitting, as it were, in the modern world. Another aspect of the imagination is described by the poet Ted Hughes. And this is just the last verse of a poem called Pike. A pond I fished 50 yards across, whose lilies and muscular tench had outlasted every visible stone of the monastery that planted them. Stilled legendary depth. It was as deep as England. It held pike too immense to stir, so immense and old, that past nightfall I dared not cast. I think what he's talking about is the unconscious, or images that aren't benign, that we might prefer to suppress. Coleridge had a concept of the imagination that is expressed with two phrases. One is fancy, and fancy, as it were, is light, improvised thinking, light invention. But imagination is the deep work. There's no other word to use here, the deep work of the soul. That is what Hughes means by these immense fish. There's something there. And in Coleridge's expression, that is the profound work of the artist, often expressed in manner, style, the way they structure things, all the things impossible to, as it were, interfere with. This is a painting called The Trial, and the origin of the painting was a description of the story of Dido and Aeneas. It's told by Virgil. And there's one particular image I became interested in, which was of Dido, the funeral pyre. It happens at dawn. So you've got to imagine the pink of dawn, the heat of the flames, and somewhere the Trojan fleet with Aeneas leaving her. It's a very complicated, beautiful image. The reason the painting is called The Trial is very simple. I painted a picture called Dido. I exhibited it at the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy. And I didn't like it. So I took it back, repainted it. And the process took 3 years. And in that process, my work started to shift into a different area. So this comes to another aspect of the truth of painting, which is, what actually is it physically? What is going on in the painting? It's covering up. One layer of paint covers up another layer of paint. You feel already the symbolism in that act. The lightest thing in a painting is the ground. If it's a white canvas, you can never get lighter than that. Everything must get darker. And then out of relationships, you build a sense of light. I'm sure most of you know the Turner painting of Cologne in this great room here. This is one of the great rooms of the world next door. The Turner painting of Cologne glows. It's the most uncanny, extraordinary thing. It glows. It's a visionary object. But what you're looking at isn't white. And if you held up a piece of white paper, you'd find that the paint is dull. It glows out of the relationships that he has constructed there. So this sense of touch and immediacy is absolutely essential. This painting is called Enter the City, and it's partly me in my King's Highway mode. Enter the city. But of course, Aeneas entered Carthage invisibly, which again strikes me as a type of metaphor for painting. These paintings, incidentally, particularly this one, are very large, and it's very rare you can trick your own children. All of us will rejoice at this, but my youngest son, who they take their father's work, of course, completely for granted, as all children do, and quite rightly. But he came into the studio, and he came around the corner, and he saw this, and his jaw dropped, and he stepped back. And I thought, yes, got you. And that's extremely unusual. In other words, the physicality of the painting spoke to him before he could analyze it, put it in its place, or all the other 100 things we do with paintings to tame them. But paintings aren't tame, and they are somehow unknowable and ungraspable. The other question, which I suppose we're skirting around here, or not we, I am skirting around here, is this question in terms of the values of high art, the values of truth, is the question of the sacred. These words make us enormously uncomfortable. I don't know why. Maybe I'm just saying they make me uncomfortable. But there is something powerful about these words. And let me just try a list of these words. Beauty, faith, truth, imagination, nobility, there's an uncomfortable word, immortality, sacred. But you know, and I know, that they're immensely powerful, these words. So we're reluctant to use them and get it wrong. But nevertheless, they sit in this world of high art. For me, certainly. This painting is called The Poet Architect, and the idea for it came from a piece of writing by the last great French symbolist poet, Paul Valéry, who'd known Mallarmé, he was one of that great generation, extraordinarily important poet. And it was a short piece of writing which struck me as having a wonderful insight into what I'm talking about. It's about architecture, it's about making, and it's called, I think it's called Eupalinos, E-U-P-A-L-I-N-O-S. It is about this subject. He says effectively that the question, does God exist, can be answered in words, and there are immensely complex arguments that have gone on for thousands of years around this subject. And I promise you, I'm not going to make any contribution at all to that tonight. But, except for this, what Valéry says is this, that making is itself a type of answer. So an answer, a positive answer to the world, is in making. And this is what artists do. Not artists alone, everybody involved with making. Except that making at the level of the art you see next door seems to be particularly special. So the implication of that is that making at this level does have an element of the sacred. At least it has this, for certain. It has an element of faith. Because in order to believe that it's worthwhile, without even knowing what any result will be, you point forward in a particular direction. Therefore, it's a matter of faith. So lastly, a poem by Edward Thomas. This is a painting called Symphony. More of the physical, more of my handling. And a painting called Fall. This poem is called The Path. Running along a bank, a parapet that saves from the precipitous wood below, the level road, there is a path. It serves children for looking down the long, smooth steep between the legs of beech and yew to where a fallen tree checks the sight, while men and women content themselves with the road and what they see over the bank and what the children tell. The path, winding like silver, trickles on, bordered and even invaded by thinnest moss, tries to cover roots and crumbling chalk with gold, olive, and emerald, but in vain. The children wear it. They flattened the bank on top and silvered it between the moss with the current of their feet, year after year. But the road is houseless and leads not to school. To see a child is rare there, and the eye has but the road, the wood that overhangs and underyawns it, and the path that looks as if it led on to some legendary or fancied place where men have wished to go and stay, till sudden it ends where the wood ends. And lastly, I just want to read you one final poem. Are we all right for time, Susan? Yes. One final poem, which I only realized this afternoon seems entirely appropriate to the place where we are. And it's called the Musée des Beaux-Arts. It's written by W.H. Auden. You're nodding, Susan. Written in 1938 in Brussels. It's about a painting by Bruegel. About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. How well they understood its human position, how it takes place while someone else is eating or opening a window or just walking dully along. How, when the aged are reverently, passionately waiting for the miraculous birth, there always must be children who did not specially want it to happen, skating on a pond at the edge of a wood. They never forgot that even the dreadful martyrdom must run its course. Anyhow, in a corner, some untidy spot where the dogs go on with their doggy life and the torturer's horse scratches its innocent behind on a tree. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it was not an important failure. The sun shone, as it had to, on the white legs, disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to and sailed calmly on. Thank you.